The first question, who are the princes of Israel referred to in Ezekiel? There is no scripture reference on this, so I'm going to take a general shot. If this is talking about Ezekiel 19, for instance, the princes of Israel would be basically the people who reigned in Israel after Josiah. So it'd be like Jehoiakim, Zedekiah. There's another one, I forget his name. But they all sound alike. There's Jehoiakim. Do I? No. They all have the Jehoiah in them, and there's 3 of them, and then there's Zedekiah as well. So you can get their specific names in Kings, the book of 2 Kings. But so those are the princes of Israel. It's the 4 last rulers after Josiah. Now this one, I'm going to answer the basic question, and I'm going to kind of build on it too. It's how many books are in the Bible? That's a little bit up for debate. So I'll give the simple answer first off. 66 Bibles. 30 books of the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. But there are different branches that will do different numbers. So, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses have their own version of the Bible where they take some stuff out and they put some other stuff in. They've done their own translation. It's not really a translation. It's more of just like a reinterpretation. It's like they're rewriting the story. Then if you talk to the Mormons, for instance, they're going to have, the Bible, but then they're going to also have, Pearl of Great Price, different stuff like that. And so they're going to have a little bit more stuff there. Then the Catholics are going to have some books in there that they refer to as books of the church. And so it doesn't necessarily have the same amount of authority, but in Catholic tradition, they're kind of all seen as just a blanket books of the church. So it really depends what tradition you are a part of. In just typical Protestant, it's going to be 66 books of the Bible, though. How old will we be in heaven? Well, heaven doesn't really have age like that. See, our bodies right now, as we have them, as we wear them, they are made for age. You can look at a toddler and say, this is a young person, right? And then you get older, you can start seeing typical things of an older person, maybe hunched back, maybe not walking as fast as you used to, those kinds of things. But in all these things, our bodies are made with the idea of age to them. Well, in heaven, we're going to have a resurrected body which is free of the confines of age. We're not going to have, it's a body that's not made to deteriorate. Does that make sense? So whereas we're still going to recognize each other, there is definitely going to be a change of the body. What does that look like? I have no idea. But there is definitely the difference between here on earth having a body that is made to age, and in heaven having a body that is not made to age. Is Jehovah's Witness and Mormon the same as us? So, long story short, no. They don't believe in the same things as far as salvation, Jesus, etc. But we're actually going to expand on that a lot more when we're done with Hebrews. We're going to go through different cults and the occult, both kind of putting it all together. And we'll be able to look more in depth at that. Were there dinosaurs on the ark? So this has 3 basic answers to it, and I'm going to tell you all 3 of them before I kind of give you my view. So the first view, which is not held by too many nowadays, but there are some who hold this, is that dinosaurs never existed. I find that very unlikely, but, if that's the way you take it, teach their own. The other view is that, yes, dinosaurs did exist, and they were on the ark. I find this view also unlikely. Just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And then there's the third view, which it makes the most sense, in my opinion. Once again, you're free to your own opinion. And that's that there were dinosaurs, but they died off before the ark. My view, as I've actually shared it, is that the flood was not a global flood, so there was really no reason to have every single animal from all over the planet and have them swim across the Atlantic or Pacific or whatever. And so they wouldn't have had to have the dinosaurs in there anyways, even if the dinosaurs were still alive. So it's really a matter of probabilities, I guess. If you go to the ark that they have in Kentucky or wherever that is, Kansas, Kentucky. Anyways, wherever that is, the ark that they've built, the life-size ark, they have dinosaurs on that. And I guess their assumption is that there were dinosaurs on the ark. How were the books of the Bible named? Okay, so this is going to be pretty easy. I'll break it up into Old Testament and New Testament. I'll start with the two odd ducks out in the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes, what a word, huh? Which basically means preacher. So that's, it's fine. And then the other odd duck out in the Old Testament is Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. The idea of that is just it's the Song of Songs. It's the best of songs, a song of love. And a Song of Solomon doesn't actually necessarily mean that Solomon had to have written it. It just has to do primarily with Solomon's love, the Song of Solomon, But, he could have written it. It's not really important one way or another. And then the rest of the books are fairly self-explanatory. So the prophets are named after the prophet that did the prophesying. So like Isaiah, stuff like that. The 5 books of the law that are at the beginning are a little bit of an exception because how the Jews name them are a lot different than how the Protestants name them. The Jews name them basically off of the first couple words from the book. So their names for the books differ a little bit from what our names are for the book. But I'm just going to say, how do we get the English names? And we'll just settle on that. In English, we have the names basically mean what the book is about. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically. So Genesis is beginning, so it's not about the beginning of the world and the beginning of the nation of Israel. It's a book of beginnings. Exodus is about a people having an exodus, where Israel had an exodus from Egypt. It's kind of, follows along that same theme. Leviticus was actually somewhat misnamed because the idea was that most of the book had to do with the tribe of Levi, which is not true. Only a portion of the book has to do with the tribe of Levi. So it kind of misnamed, but that's why it's named Leviticus. And the Numbers, they didn't really know what was going on in Numbers because there's a lot of different themes. And it just seems to just be kind of sporadic and go everywhere. So they said, let's just name it Numbers because, it's got a lot of numbers in there, so it's fine. And then Deuteronomy means second law because it's where Moses repeated the law to the next generation before he died and before they went into the Promised Land. So then you got all the books of history, which are pretty much named for the period or person, which is the main thing. So Joshua for Joshua, Judges for the book of Judges, just kind of makes sense that way. And Kings and Chronicles, and it all kind of, all fits with what's going on there. Esther named after the person historically that's centered on. Ruth, same kind of thing there. First and Second Samuel is a little bit different because Samuel dies in book 1, but that's probably because his disciples, finished off the section. They finished off 2 Samuel after he had died, just to kind of give closure to the topic being discussed, if you will. Let's see, other books in the Old Testament. Oh, and then you get the wisdom literature, which would be like Psalms, because it's a collection of Israel's songs and song. Proverbs, because it's a collection of Proverbs. And they're all pretty much self-explanatory there. The New Testament gets a little more complicated. So in the New Testament, we'll start with the Gospels. There's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And not always do we have a name attached to a book that was always historically attached to that book. But with the Gospels, you got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of those 4 Gospels, only 2 of them were actually disciples of Jesus, which was Matthew and John. Mark was not a disciple, and Luke was not. Obviously, I should say that differently. They were followers of Jesus, but they weren't like one of the 12 or anything. So only 2 of the 4 were written by one of the 12. And with Mark, the theory is that Peter was the one who was guiding it, but Mark was the one who was actually writing it down. And take that however you want. So the names would have been associated with whoever was blamed for writing it, if you will. So Matthew, we'll call it Matthew, and so on and so forth. Acts was named because it follows the progression of the church. It's about the apostles and what happened to the church. It's actually a 2-part. Luke and Acts were written by the same author to the same person, Theophilus, for pretty much the same reasons. So whereas Luke is focused on a Spirit-filled Christ, Acts is focused on a Spirit-filled church. And so they're just kind of both written to show that. Then you get to what are called the epistles, which is a big fancy word that basically means letter. And Paul's epistles or Paul's letters are pretty much named for the people they went to. So Romans to Rome, Corinthians to the church at Corinth, so on and so forth. Then you get to what are called general epistles. Now, this basically means that it went to a place generally. It didn't go to one specific place. So like James, for instance, is called James because James wrote a letter to Christians in this area over here, and then Peter wrote them to this area over here of like Galatia and stuff. So you got all these different things like that, and they're just called vaguely Peter or James or whatever, rather than trying to name who it goes to. Obviously, Hebrews doesn't follow that. It was written to a group of Hebrews. We don't really exactly know where. Probably Rome, but you don't really know for sure. And that takes us to all those books. So then that leads the last one would be Revelation, which is named Revelation because of the first words in it. Apocalypsis Jesu Christu, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, or the revelation of Jesus Christ. So apocalypse would then be Revelation, and that's where it gets the name, because it's about, the end things. So I think I hit all the books. Yeah. Pretty sure I did. I think I hit all these questions too. We've got 2 more to look at. But before we go to them, any questions? Now, you joke, but actually, let me kind of clarify this. So, Bible actually is just a word meaning book. So you'll see in different books, it'll say like the bread Bible or something like that. It's not sacrilegious or anything. It's just a word that means book, and they're saying it's a book of bread. You can also have like the gun Bible and stuff like that. And it's not being sacrilegious or anything. It's just explaining that it's a book. I know you said that as a joke, but I figured I'd build on it anyways. So, any Spencer? Sure. Well, as far as I know, it was the same fish as we got nowadays. I nothing in the Bible says anything different. Doesn't really say one way or another. I'm assuming it would have been about the same because it wasn't that long ago that the events happened. For a fish to get progressively bigger or smaller has to be quite a bit of time. So I'm assuming it's about the same. It's a good fishing question, Anything else? Okay. Go ahead and play that first video. If you could put it on the screen, would be nice, but you don't have to if it won't go. Okay, a lot of interesting things that he said there, and this is somewhat of a common view. So this isn't something that should blow us away that he said. There's a lot of people have very similar views. And I'm just going to go through, and then if you guys want to say anything or ask questions or whatever, we can do that. So first off, there's really a danger that happens, very common in our culture, where if someone is smart in one area, people listen to them about every area, right? So he's an astrophysicist, right? So therefore, he must know everything about everything because astrophysics are kind of hard. And I understand where this idea comes from, but maybe not the best standard. You can be really smart in one area and just be a complete idiot in another area. That happens all the time, For instance, I know Greek, but Latin is a mystery to me. Just because I know Greek, you wouldn't come to me for Latin, would you? Well, of course not. In the same way, so you can have an opinion about God. That's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. You don't have to have qualifications to have an opinion about God. But he's having opinions about history and literature when he obviously is not schooled in history or literature. So I'll get to that in just a minute. But next thing I wanted to mention is that Genesis, he mentions there in the video that Genesis is primarily an account of nature, but that's not true. Genesis is not primarily an account of nature. It's an account of theology. It has nature and history in it, but its purposes are more theological. It's trying to say things that are absolutely essential. So, and I think I have this written down somewhere else, but basically when you look at the biblical account of creation, you compare it to other manuscripts of the time from other religions, you see a lot of big differences, and I'll get back to that. But so there's basically two things that he overlooks, and that's varying interpretations and varying translations. Okay, varying interpretations and varying translations. What that means is that there are more than one way to look at different passages of the Bible. And there might be one way that a certain passage is looked at a lot, and that doesn't mean that it's right. It just means that it's a commonly held view. A great example of this is actually with evolution. Did you know that not all evolutionary theory believes that people evolved from monkeys? Some evolutionary theories believe that, but not all of them. But when you're talking to people about evolution, they act like that's an immovable barrier in evolution. It's not. And why I bring that up is not to tell you that we came from monkeys. My point is simply when you're talking to people about evolution, that's my point. So then there's also varying translations. Not everything in the Bible is black and white. When you're translating, sometimes there's a wide margin of error, and you don't really know exactly how something should be translated. So sometimes we take a guess as translators. We just take a guess. And then it turns out later on that we were wrong. And so then you know what we do? We retranslate it once we realize that our translation was wrong. That's okay. Like, that happens. So there's a lot of different things like that he just doesn't really seem to understand. And then there's another question specifically about Genesis, and that's this. Is Genesis 1 from the perspective of heaven or from the perspective of earth? And that might not sound like a big issue, but it is a big issue because elsewhere in the Bible, I believe it's in the Psalms, it explains that there was no light on the earth because there was clouds and thick darkness around the earth. So in other words, the sun was already there, they just couldn't see it because the light was hidden. Or is this from heaven's perspective, in which case the light simply was not there? And the problem, I think, is one that people come to a little bit too flippantly, especially modern atheists, and that's that we have never once observed a creation event. Science is about observing the physical, repeatable phenomena, observable and repeatable. That's how you have to do science. So if it's not observable or repeatable, you really can't be too persnickety about it because you just don't know. You can theorize, but you can't say, okay, now watch when it happens again, right? So like, for instance, the Big Bang. We know that matter, that space is going out. So that means it came from a singularity, right? Well, has it always been traveling at the same speed? And then also, could we be wrong about that? So there's a lot of things there that we don't really know. We've never seen it before. We'll probably never see it again. We never observed a creation event. So what did it actually look like when it happened? I don't know. When the Big Bang happened, what did that actually look like? You know. And then also there's the issue which I feel like people don't take seriously, and I feel like it should be taken seriously, is when the world came into being, did it come in with age? Did God create the world with age? Do we know? Does the Bible say? No, the Bible doesn't say. It says that he made it, but he doesn't say he made it with age or without age. When Adam and Eve were created, did he make them out of the dust into an adult, or did he make them into a baby? Well, it didn't say anything about God giving someone to breastfeed them, so how would they have come out of their baby state? I'm assuming that means that they were created with age. So could he have done the same thing with creation? Well, I don't know. But there's a lot of things that we don't know, and I think it's really, really important that we don't just start hopping off into these really, really opinionated things if we're not positive. And that goes for religious people and atheists. Then there's the point that he completely overlooks, which I feel like is a major shame, that the Old Testament worldview is singular. And that's when compared to other ancient and other modern worldviews. It is a singular idea. This whole idea that worship of God is dependent on how you treat other people, that's a singular idea. The other religions of the ancient world did not have that. Modern worldview does not have that. This is something that came from somewhere else. Where did this come from? Okay, I mentioned this on Sunday, there's only 3 religions who have been rooted in this idea, and they all came from the exact same one. Abraham. It all came from Abraham. So Judaism carried this idea first, and then Christianity was an adaptation of Judaism, and then Islam was an adaptation of Christianity and Judaism. So you've got, they're all from the same source, and it's the only example of this worldview in the whole of creation, and it's not something you can just overlook. But once again, he's not a historian; he's an astrophysicist. Also, the creation event itself, as described in Genesis, is a very unique situation. So in the ancient world, there were these gods that they fought, and then their bodies were used to make the sky. Or maybe in this other account, like in the Egyptian account, one of the gods had ejaculation, and that caused life to appear. And so there's all these different views. But when we get to Genesis, we don't see God being a sexual being that is, fornicating on the ground, if you will. We don't see him having this cosmic battle with other gods. We see him speaking and it coming into existence. Where did this idea come from when no others had this idea? I was listening to a comedian, which I think he said it perfectly. He said, there's basically two ideas of where everything came from. There's the people who say that God did it, and then there's the people that say that nothing did it. And he said, well, God may not exist, but you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. And I was like, well, he's not wrong. When you're talking about these kinds of things, and then he closed out with this, which I laughed really hard when he said this. He said, and the funny thing is that the nothing people make fun of the God people, and it's like, yeah, that's accurate. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense because and this is really what it comes down to when you're talking with atheists and those kinds of things, is they're going to bring up this whole from nothing thing, and it's like, well, nothing with nothing can't make everything, and they can't make order, and this is just, it's silly. But, C.S. Lewis actually wrote that it's never a good idea to start a conversation proving God from the argument of the cosmos. It's always best to start with an argument from the person. He says that in The Problem of Pain. The Problem of Pain. So also another thing that he fails to overlook is that people knew that the earth was round as early as the 300s BC. You say, well, why is that important? Because he just said the thing about the whole stars thing. By the time that Revelations was written, everybody knew that the earth was round. Like, what is he talking about? Revelation doesn't say those because he's ignorant of scientific theory. It says those things because Revelation is written as, I am seeing these things and I'm describing them to you. So is he going to give us scientific definitions in the book of Revelation? No, he's not going to give us scientific definitions. He's going to say, I saw these things, this is what it looked like, and now I'm telling them to you. The dragon, do you really think there's a dragon? No, the dragon is symbolic of Satan. I mean, you can read the whole thing. The woman is, of course, what happens with the baby, with Jesus and all that, which I don't want to get off topic here, so I'll keep going. And actually, nothing in the Bible claims that the earth is round. And this is something I'm going to build on in just a second. There's a lot of people nowadays who claim that the earth is flat, which I don't know where this idea came from. And so now they're even saying, if you believe in the Bible, you have to believe that the earth is flat, because the Bible teaches that the Bible does not teach that the earth is flat. And when you're dealing with common speech that we all use, imprecise speech is extremely common. For instance, do we still say things like the sun is setting? Well, of course we say stuff like the sun is setting. But did you know the sun isn't really setting? Did you know that? Well, of course you knew that. You're not an idiot. You know what I mean? But we still use that kind of language. We use that kind of language all the time. Does the Bible have to be written from the perspective of an astrophysicist to be true? No, it doesn't. Do the writers of the Bible have to have full understanding of how the world works to write it? No, they don't. They can write something that's be true and not necessarily factually, scientifically true. Does that kind of make sense? And I could give you examples, but I've kind of already talked about that before, so if you're curious about that, we can come back to it later. And then also another thing that he takes, he makes fun of, and I feel like this is a really bad idea to do, and that's that there's different types of literature. There's different types of literature. This is something that he shouldn't have been so flippant about, because some types of literature is actually poetical, some types is historical narrative. And so then he says, well, nobody had these distinctions of the Bible text until after science came out. What is he talking about? There were people who were wondering if Song of Solomon was a metaphor all the way back with Augustine. What are you talking about? This is something that didn't come out until science. That's just a silly thing to say. And ignoring is ignoring the meaning. If you ignore the genre of the literature, you're ignoring the meaning of the text. Really, honestly, truly, that's how it is. For instance, in Much Ado About Nothing by Shakespeare, Beatrice says this line. If you're familiar with Shakespeare, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, like me, you're like, who are those people? Don't worry about it. You're not in high school. You'll probably never read it. If you haven't read it up to now, you probably never will. I hate Shakespeare, but I'm using it to use a point, okay? What fire is in mine ears? Well, is Beatrice saying that there's actually fire in her ears? No, she's not, of course not, right? We all know that. But we understand that it's poetical. In the same way, why can't we say the same thing about the Bible, where if there's something that's obviously poetical, it should be understood as poetical? And then there's some things that are going to be said with, as metaphors and allusions and stuff. Illusions, Michael. And so that takes us to the idea of why I brought up the whole earth being flat thing, and that's this. A common misinterpretation does not make the Bible wrong. Just because there's a commonly held view about the Bible that is wrong doesn't mean that the Bible is wrong. It means that your view about the Bible is wrong. You see what I'm saying? I'll give you a great example. In Genesis, it says that Eve was fashioned out of from the rib of Adam's side, right? And a lot of people have actually taken this way farther than it needed to be and said, to this day, men don't have as many ribs as women. Well, that's silly. We will have the same amount of ribs. That's not true. Second off, the word there is actually better translated stuff. He took some of the stuff from Adam's side. Not literally a rib, like, ow, my rib. But some of the stuff. He took some of the essence of Adam and formed Eve. But people are very familiar and comfortable with the idea of rib. So a lot of times we'll just say rib just because, let's just avoid the whole conflict. We'll just call it a rib. It's fine. See, but translation-wise, rib isn't really accurate. It's probably a much better translation to say the stuff from the side. But we're not going to die on this hill, right? But at the same side, you see what I'm saying? Where it's a common misinterpretation, nobody's really going to lose their salvation about it, so kind of just ignore it. And it doesn't make the Bible wrong. It makes your view of the Bible wrong. The Bible's not wrong. And there's a lot of times when that kind of stuff will happen. When the Crusades happened, those were people slaughtering other people, and they did it under the banner of Christ. Does that make them Christian? No, it means that they called themselves Christian. There's a difference. Lots of people call themselves Christians and don't even know Jesus. I mean, nowadays we see that all the time. I'm a religious person, right? So Bible study is about what it meant to say, not what you can twist it into saying. And we actually did a class about this last year where I brought this point up, that if you ignore the context of Scripture, you can make it say anything. The Bible has been used for all kinds of atrocities and all kinds of good things too. But the thing I'm getting at is people really twist it for whatever purposes a lot of times. And so the problem there would be overzealous people, not God or the Bible. Very big difference there. So then he says something that just doesn't make any sense. So I'm assuming that everybody here is familiar with the scientific theory. You form a hypothesis, you test it, and then you change it and adapt it, and you carry on and so forth until you find the solution to the thing. This is called, in a way, reinterpreting the data, which is exactly what he criticized religious people for doing, but that's exactly what scientists do. You form a theory, and then if it's wrong, you reform a new theory. A good example of this is evolution. Darwinian evolution has actually been disproven. However, scientists still believe in evolution. Why? Because they changed it, they adapted it to fit the new evidence, and they move forward. And a lot of the evidence that they accept now is hypothetical evidence that doesn't really even exist. But they say, well, it must have been that because we've got the finished product. So they're walking with the same skeleton, but it just kind of has new skin on it. And you see this a lot with the single-celled problem. So, just in case it's been too long from high school, okay? This is supposedly how evolution says, okay? All life started with a single-celled organism, right? Everybody knows that, right? And then that evolved into all the different life forms that we have today, right? You guys remember this from high school, right? So there's a major problem with that. How many two-celled organisms are there in the world? Anybody take a guess? None. Not a single two-celled organism. What about three-celled organism? None. Yep. Four-celled? You get when I'm going with this. Five-celled. Well, if you go online and read this is what they're going to say. There probably are five-celled organisms. We just don't know of any. Okay. So basically, your whole idea is that everything came from a single-celled organism, but you don't have examples of any of those other evolutionary steps that supposedly exist. You have single-celled organisms, and then you have complex organisms. So what about the intermediate areas there? And this by itself wouldn't cripple evolution. You could find an answer to that. But it's yet another piece that is not quite fitting. But yet what scientists do is rather than throwing out the whole theory of evolution, they reinterpret. And that's exactly what we do with the Bible. We translate, we interpret, this is what I think the Bible is saying. And then we find out we're wrong, we reinterpret. It's not something that he should be ridiculing, it's something that is how the world works. And so the writers of the Bible, they saw the world, they didn't live in a vacuum. He makes the comment that if you were to just go to the Bible and form your theory of science just from that, well, the people didn't live in a vacuum. They saw the world, they lived in the world, and they didn't just have the Bible, they had their eyes too. And then, other parts of the Bible give more details than just Genesis by itself. But he kind of takes that apart too and just kind of throws that away with all of it. A lot of different things he overlooked. So then you get to Revelation, which is the example that he used about the stars falling out of the sky. And he makes fun of it because, it's just poetical and all this different stuff. Well, hold on. What about the dragon? He didn't mention that, which is obviously not a literal historical detail. What about the creatures? What about the scrolls? What about the mark of the beast, which I don't know a single theory that takes that literally. People have said that it's microchips. They've said that it's 5G networks. They've said that it was President Obama. They've said all these different things about the mark of the beast. And yet, nobody ever says that it was like a literal thing of, it's a mark that says 666. No, they always attribute it to some other thing, some other grander metaphor, right? Something, right? And yet, for whatever reason, he ignores all of that and says, well, when it talks about stars falling from heaven and hitting the earth, that's where I draw the line. What? So you're obviously dealing with a book that's not dealing with scientific details. It's dealing with truths instead. Just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. A good example of this is it actually says that the sky will be rolled back, right, like a scroll. I actually think that is a literal thing that's going to happen. My theory, which I could be wrong, is I think that in that time, God will literally pull back the universe, and the earth will not be floating in the universe. It'll be kind of confined in a place with just God is pouring out his wrath on this thing, and they're still going to be rejecting him. That might be out there for some people. I'm not teaching it as something the Bible says. It's just my own personal theory. So we're not talking about twisting the Bible. We're talking about learning and adapting and trying to find what the original intent is. And the Bible is oftentimes attacked by a lot of people, such as Neil Tyson, but later it's oftentimes been proved. For instance, the Philistines. Do you know how many historical documents the Philistines left us? Not a one. The only reason we have any written record about the Philistines is from other people writing about them, like the Bible. The Bible is one of the main sources for the Philistines ever even existing. We have an Egyptian document, too, and some other things, but you get what I'm saying. Then there's the Babylonians. There for a long time, people actually said the Babylonians did not exist and that the Bible was wrong, and then they started unearthing and digging, and they're like, oh, yeah, our bad. The Babylonians did exist. Oh, I didn't think that. And so you can't just start making fun of the Bible and start off with the idea that it's wrong, because it's just, what's that, guilty until proven innocent? It's just not really but just put you in the right mindset. And then obviously science alone can't really answer everything, which he also ignores. And then you get stars falling out of the sky, which I want to give you 3 different interpretations for that part in Revelation where it says that the stars are going to fall out of the sky and land on the earth. And any 3 of these are possible, and also there could be something else as well. So first off, the stars falling could be meteors. From his perspective, it looked like stars, but it could have just been meteors. And there's nothing wrong with that. The second view is this is talking about a time where the destruction of the earth is. So basically, when the stars fall out, the earth is this 6th scroll being opened is actually when the earth is being destroyed, and this is what it looks like while it's being destroyed. I don't really hold to that view, but I guess it's possible. And then there's also a kind of a historical detail, which once again he probably didn't know because he's not a historian. And that's that imagery that it gives there about the stars falling, and that kind of stuff is very, very popular. It's a very common poetical way of showing a huge desolation, a bunch of bad stuff happening. So if the Bible was the only ancient literature that talked about that'd be one thing, but it's not. But once again, he just kind of overlooks that. So do you have to fully understand to write what you see? No. And then he says that everybody who had based their scientific theory on the Bible got it wrong. Is that true? Every single person? Everybody? I seem to remember a lot of religious people who made a lot of really important discoveries, such as heliocentrism by, was that Kepler? No, Copernicus? No. It doesn't matter. That guy that lived forever ago. And then he says about that they all got the wrong answer, as if we have full knowledge about what the right answer is, right? And when he talks about these, he talks about it so flippantly, and oftentimes if you just, it sounded really good when he said it, you know what I mean? But if you just stop and take the argument apart, it's like, there's a lot of stuff here, and we're probably about out of time. What time is it? Anybody know? 10 till? Okay, so we're probably not going to go to the last last question. I just wanted to make a comment about the God of the gaps. So the God of the gaps is a theory that I despise. Like, I absolutely hate this theory. Basically, it says that we can figure things out. But there's going to be a few things that we're not quite sure about, and that's where we just insert God. And he hits on it, but doesn't really expand it too much. He tries to make it a thing where it's the religious thing that people do. But not all religious people do this. I mean, yes, there are some people who are religious to do this, but not all of them. And it's based on three basic premises. First off, I only need God when I can't figure it out. Basically, it's the idea of, I'm going to do and solve my life problems, but then when there's something I can't figure out, then I'll pray about it. Okay, and it's kind of the same idea. So I'm going to go to the world and I'm going to say, I can figure it out. And then the second premise it's based on is it doesn't matter what the Bible says, but what I want it to say or what my tradition says. And specifically he brought it up about science, but, it's something similar there. And then the third premise, whatever I don't understand, I'll fill in with God. So the basic problem with this, obviously, you probably noticed it yourself already, but the Bible is not really history or science. It has history or science, but it's not that by itself. And you can grasp, you can go to the world and make observations without twisting the Bible to fit that. And you can also grasp what it's saying without ignoring the knowledge of study. You know what I mean? You can love science and the Bible. That's fine. You're going to find a lot of times people tell you it's either or and it's not. But I would definitely say that you as a Christian, we should be very careful not to speak when the Bible doesn't, right? So a lot of times people will they'll misunderstand an idea of the Bible and they'll just kind of run with it, like the earth being flat, and then they'll just kind of carry it to their grave and be like, no, the Bible teaches this. I can't deny the Bible. And it's like, well, that's not really something that the Bible said. Is there a verse in the Bible that says the earth is flat? No, there's not. So then maybe don't be too strong about going that into the ground, because God isn't a God of the gaps. If you go to the world with, I can figure it all out and just plug God wherever I can't figure it out, what happens when you figure it out? What happens when you get an answer to that problem? Well, then all of a sudden you don't need God anymore. And so you get the realm of God in your life is getting smaller and smaller, while your knowledge of science is getting bigger and bigger. And the whole time you realize that your faith wasn't really based on God. It was based on having answers. So then once you have answers, you're satisfied. You don't need God. The God of the gaps is not a workable theory. You can't realistically say, okay, so I'm just going to stick God in everywhere that I can't figure it out. That's not a realistic way of looking at the world. So I hope that kind of makes sense, and I hope that I answered those questions well. Are there any other questions or any other comments? Either or.